So thank you all for coming today to our training on data storytelling. It's going to be a little bit focused on sort of some lean scenarios, but it'll serve generally as a guide for doing data analysis and presenting research in a public service type role. So hopefully it'll be accessible to many of you. All right, I will go ahead and share my screen. And we can get started. All right. So this is a training that I've given a couple of times, including to a couple of lean conferences. But the basic premise is such that we want to avoid this scenario. So this is the only slide in the entire training that I'm giving today that has a table in it. And I don't think I need to convey to anyone here that this is not ideal, that presenting this to anyone will convince anyone of anything, and that you can't even understand most of the stuff that's on here because it's from a very specific database with very specific fields that I don't want to dig into at the moment. Although some of the people in this training might actually recognize this data set. I should hope that it doesn't need explaining that you don't want to put large, complicated spreadsheets in a PowerPoint presentation, and I would expect that you don't do that. But there's a fine nuance to not just conveying information and your research, but also to making it compelling, making an argument, and having it stick, which is a whole other challenge. So this presentation is about data storytelling, so based on the 10 phases of innovation, we can talk through the 7 reasons why you might want to tell a story as part of your data presentation. So storytelling builds credibility. It sort of helps to see how all the pieces fit together. Storytelling evokes emotions in a way that cold, sterile graphs and charts may not necessarily on their own. A lot of times, if you're telling a story, it'll allow you to explore some controversial spaces or uncomfortable topics in a way that just showing someone data that maybe confronts some of their pre-existing understanding might challenge things. It is much more impactful in terms of swaying people's points of views. It can create heroes, so we can sort of see how we fit into the story and sort of identify ourselves within the story. It also provides an entire vocabulary around change, because if you're starting with world building and building out a world in terms of data, then it sort of allows you to take everyone with you on this journey. And it makes order out of chaos. Our brains seek stories. They seek a rise and a fall. There's a reason why we have so many stories that are so similar. And we're going to be talking a little bit about how to make this happen in our data storytelling. So just a bit more evidence in case I haven't convinced you already that data storytelling is valuable. For those of you that are familiar with the show Adam Ruins Everything, he actually, basically a year ago at this point, did an episode where he ruined his own show, and about how the structure of the show and the stories that they're trying to tell, why that's important versus the overall fact-finding nature of the show. So in the show, he presents an argument. They always include citations. So in this episode, they cited a study that looked at over 700 papers on climate change and found that those with narrative storytelling were more widely cited and circulated. And when it comes to remembering facts from data storytelling, we tend to remember them more accurately if they come in story form. It's because of how our brains work and how we remember things and process things. It helps if it fits into a matrix with a start, a middle, and an end. Does anyone have any stories about a time they heard a data story, or a story that they remember really well that could have been presented in a less informative way? I do have access to the chat window here, so I'll see anything that anyone puts in chat. It's fine if we don't. All right. So there are a lot of different kind of stories we can tell, but if we're going to choose a story architecture to hang our data on, my preference is for the hero's journey. So the hero's journey is a term coined by Joseph Campbell in 1949. You might also heard of it called the monomyth. It is one of our most ancient storytelling frameworks, and it has endured for a reason. And most major motion pictures, most of the stories we read or hear about, all fit this basic framework. And it begins with an ordinary world where a person's in an ordinary situation. It proceeds to the call to adventure. So something will happen which starts the entire journey. Usually there will be a refusal of the call, so something that occurs that will prevent basically anyone from going on this magical journey. Usually they'll meet a mentor at this point, so someone with knowledge of the special world that can provide guidance and information. In a lot of cases, it's a literal wizard. Crossing the threshold, so basically the point of no return, where you're entering this magical world and the special world, and things will never be the same again. Test allies and enemies are usually the bulk of the story. So it's making friends, it's finding adventures, it's learning, it's growing. And then we have the approach to the Dragon's Den, which is the build up to the climax of the story. The ordeal, which is the climax of the story, the final fight, the greatest challenge, seizing the treasure. So once you've defeated the final villain or overcome the final obstacle, you can claim that treasure. The road back. So typically these are cyclical stories. So all this learning and growth has proceeded, but we can't really understand the learning and the growth that's proceeded unless we compare it back to the ordinary world. The resurrection. So you have someone that's new and grown and learned a lot of new skills, and then returning with the boon. So they've returned, but they're different, they're changed, they're better. And you can repeat this cycle multiple times, and that's how you end up with stories that have sequels. There are several famous examples, so things like To Kill a Mockingbird, ancient stories like the Odyssey, Wizard of Oz, E.T., Rocky, they all fit vaguely this theme. We're going to walk through one really quick, which is the Harry Potter story. Even if you're not familiar with Harry Potter, I hope that you can see the pattern in this. So it starts with our ordinary world, Harry Potter living in the cupboard underneath the stairs. That's his ordinary world. That's everything kind of stinks, but he understands the way things work, and he's at the bottom of the power totem pole. But his life doesn't remain that way forever. So he receives a letter to attend Hogwarts, and that's his call to adventure. There's a whole world that he didn't even know existed until today. But he doesn't believe that he could be a real wizard, and being a wizard comes with dangers that he finds out very quickly. Hagrid sort of forms the mentor role, at least in the very first Harry Potter story, where he goes to Diagon Alley and he sort of like learns the various pieces of the wizarding world. He crosses the threshold when he learns about his parents' death at the hands of Voldemort. So he's fully sunken into this special world now. It's unavoidable. It's a part of who he is, and there's no going back. So his life at Hogwarts, his classes, his friends, those are his test allies and enemies. As they begin their build up to the final climax, they plan to get the Philosopher's Stone, and when they finally achieve getting the Philosopher's Stone, face Quirrell in the final ordeal. I guess these two steps I think are switched, because he faces Quirrell and then gets the stone, so he seizes the treasure. Wakes up in the hospital to return to life, return with the power of the mother's love, and then returning back home, but different, changed, a better person. This is just a specific example of this archetypical monomyth story that we've repeated on and on throughout the centuries, predating even written language in some cases. So that's fun, but how can we apply that to data storytelling? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I also want to apologize a little bit. In the in-person version of this training, I have a bunch of activities that we can participate in. They didn't translate really well to digitally, so it's going to be more of a lecture format for this training specifically. In future trainings, we'll go back to more of the activities, but I hope that's okay with everyone. And maybe we'll even wrap up a little early because we don't have those activities. All right, so the fundamental question is, how is data analysis at all like a story? Well, there is treasure. There are things that the data is hiding from us, and those are key insights. So whenever you're doing an analysis of a data set, whether that be information from a database, whether that be looking at survey results, there are insights that you're looking to withdraw. What's nice about surveys is that you can specifically seek that information, but you still have to do the data analysis to pull out those key insights. Those insights grant power because they tell us if our hypothesis about the data can be verified. They tell us if what we think and what we understand about the data is reflected in the real world. So in this role, you're the hero. So using data analysis or presenting this data, it's really about being the hero that goes in, finds that data, and finds those insights. And there might be many insights and multiple ways to slice and dice data. You could find all sorts of things. So if our goal is to draw those insights or explain how we did it, then we can use this framework to sort of retrieve that treasure. So collecting data is the ordinary world. So understanding the context that the data lives in, assembling the relevant data around the edges. So in many cases, I've gotten an Excel spreadsheet that was lacking some vital information. We'll get into that in a little bit. But understanding how the data fits into the larger universe and how it's functional. But you want to world build. So ask the questions you have when you're doing research, or answer the questions that you're anticipating when you're presenting your findings. You may or may not be an expert on this data set, but the audience that you're presenting to almost certainly isn't. So the same sort of way you immerse yourself in context, you have to immerse them in context and understand what goes into the data, what the various fields are, and how that can be best represented. So the project review is the call to adventure. So at any given point, you may have lots of questions about the data, and that's good. The data should inspire those questions in you. You should try and limit assumptions if possible. We all come in with a lot of assumptions, and I find one of the biggest hurdles to thinking about things in a continuous improvement mindset is challenging your own assumptions, because we all have a feeling that things are a certain way, and others may not share that perspective. So we want to try and limit our assumptions, especially when doing data analysis. We want the data to guide our insights, not our preconceptions. So you'll want to review your data to ensure continuity, consistency, make sure the data makes sense in context, and identify any gaps that might prevent you from drawing out those insights. And as we already mentioned, Harry Potter finding out he's a wizard is a call to adventure. So data integrity issues are a refusal of the call. I don't think I've ever gotten a data set and I've looked at it and gone, yep, this is good. This is exactly what I need, formatted the way I need it. I don't have any errors, any corrections, any modifications I have to make. Getting a data set into a form where you can do something with it is a lot of work, and it might be the most vital part of the entire process. But if we're going to get past the refusal of the call, we have to overcome it. Each data set has nuances to learn and translate. A lot of databases have various indexes that you have to learn to understand and navigate around, maybe translate if you ultimately want to present this work. You have to ensure that the data set's going to provide answers to the key questions. If you're concerned it won't, then you have a responsibility to seek out that data or find out if that data exists. If not, you might have to change the kind of questions you can ask of the data because it might not be able to answer the questions you want. All data has errors, gaps, and typos, and there are a lot of tools and abilities that you can use to fix those errors and correct that information. For those of you that are green belts, you can take the Excel training courses that Justin and I have been running. But also I'm available to help with data sets. If you're having trouble looking at something and you want another set of eyes on it, I'm happy to provide that assistance. So we mentioned filling in gaps, but what if you're not the expert in the data set? So you have to find an expert. So in some cases, you're the Karate Kid learning from an old master, but someone that knows that data can help provide additional guidance to that. All right, so there are other reasons to seek a mentor, including that you might want to know what ancillary data they might have access to. So they might have data that informs the data that you're working on, or might have additional context to help inform you. Also, bringing in additional people and talking to other people might confirm to leadership, say, hey, I talked to an expert on this. You know, they confirmed that what I'm looking at is right and accurate. And it brings other people into the process, which usually helps with buy-in. All right, so crossing the first threshold is learning about the data set. And whenever I get a new data set, I always start by trying to understand the bulk statistics of that data set. So those are things like averages, population data, demographics, variability. So for example, if a data set has high variability, which means it changes a lot year over year, say 15% is a normal amount of change, and we've got 1 year that changes 10%, I know that that's not an exceptional change, that doesn't represent some sort of massive shift or adjustment, whereas another data set that typically has a 2 to 3% variation and jumps 10%, that's a big deal, and that's something you have to pay attention to. I like to run a lot of average versus median comparisons because averages are very susceptible to outliers, whereas medians are not. So if you have a large disconnect between an average and a median, it means that you might have a lot of outlying data that you need to consider. Where it's also really great is that in doing this sort of like bulk statistic overview thing, it poses a lot of questions about the data set that might be worth further exploring. So if I have noticed a giant leap in variability, it might pose me to wonder, well, why this big leap in variability, or why this change of regime, or what effect happened around this time that might inform the way the data looks based on a bulk analysis. And you want to ride that curiosity as you sort of explore a data set and you try and figure out what insights you can gain. So trials, tests, allies, and enemies. I wonder how many of you remember this old screensaver from earlier Windows days. But it's representative because a lot of times you're going to hit walls. So you're going to come in with a hypothesis and you're going to test that hypothesis, and you might test a dozen hypotheses, and not all of them are going to work out. I've gone into a data set thinking, I expect that a certain demographic group is going to behave differently than another demographic group, only to find out that there's really no difference between those two data sets. But if I thought to investigate that difference between those two groups, then the people that I'm ultimately presenting this to are also going to potentially have those concerns. And it would be really great if I mentioned these dead ends in my analysis so that I'm saying to them, you know, I thought this might be a thing. It turned out it wasn't, but now you know it's not a thing. And that saved me in a lot of cases where people are like, well, have you compared blank versus blank? And I'm like, I did. And there wasn't really anything to find there. I went looking for it and I didn't find it. And I'm sorry if it's coming off a little bit vague. I know you're all dealing with different kinds of data. Some people are dealing with financial, some people are dealing with survey. There's a million different kinds of data, so some of the stuff will sound very vague, and I apologize for that. But I like to run correlations to see if numbers are related to one another, test hypothesis, and drill down into various demographic groups. So pivot tables are really convenient for drilling down into demographic information, because assuming, like in a survey, you had a drop down that let people pick what category they went in, it's really easy to break those out by category and see if the numbers are different. And as I mentioned, when you're presenting, make sure you mention those dead ends, because those are valuable insights as well. So when we are approaching the Dragon's Den, we want to be prepared to show a bunch of key findings. We might have done a lot of analysis, and we might have a lot of things that we want to talk about with the data, but not all of it is of equivalent value in a given situation. So part of it's evaluating which data I want to share, which data I want to hold back, which data I might want on a hidden slide so I can make it available if I really need to, because it's almost universal that the level of depth and understanding that you developed while doing your analysis is more than you'll actually be presenting. You're presenting a tiny sliver of the work that you did, so it's a matter of preparing that sliver and choosing what belongs in that sliver. So determine how the data needs to be laid out. So if you need multiple pivot tables to show different things, that you have those available. Try and identify which findings are best represented as figures, tables, or text. Make sure your headers and labels will properly describe things. We've all gotten a lot more familiar at looking at logarithmic charts over the last 2 months. But before this whole pandemic thing happened, I would have been awfully worried to show a logarithmic chart, because it takes a little bit of extra explanation, and you have to decide if the level of explanation that you want to provide is worth the effort. Consider the venue for display. So there are a lot of ways in which we can display data. Sometimes it's reports, sometimes it's presentations, sometimes it's dashboards. Consider that when you're picking the data that you want to show. And if possible, build out a logical progression. So starting out with the bulk statistics and build to your biggest insight. You know, we're building up to the climax of the story, and we want it to feel that way. And by the way, if anyone has any questions or comments throughout this, feel free to drop something in the chat, or interrupt me if you need to. That's fine by me if you have questions. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end, though, too. So to me, visualization is the ordeal. It is the capstone of the work that you're trying to do, and it's very, very important to get it right. So the ordeal sometimes is facing a dragon. Visualization is my dragon. And there are a million ways in which to do this work. In my previous job, I was a hurricane researcher with the University of Wisconsin. So displaying spatial data has its own unique challenges and trials, as anyone that's tried to do that as anyone that's ever touched GIS will tell you. That's its own unique challenge. But it's not about just finding a way to display the data, it's about finding the best way to display the data. And that's really the challenge. And it's almost always worth to try and visualize the data, because we're human beings, we operate very visually. ArcGIS story maps, yeah, that's a great idea. We want to try and use graphs to show information when possible. Graphs are much, much, much more persuasive than any text or chart that you can show, and it's just part of how our brains work. It doesn't matter how logical your chart is. If it's got a visual element, it's more powerful. So we want to find a way to optimally show the data. And in our seeking of that, sometimes we create a lot of work for ourselves. So sometimes the simplicity of a figure is more valuable than the precision of its insight. And what do I mean by that? So this is a box and whisker plot. I really like box and whisker plots. For those of you that are not familiar with box and whisker plots, they are really great for visualizing how data is arranged. So it's sort of like a top-down view of a histogram, where roughly 50% of the data is within this box. Outlying data is depicted right here. These lines represent quartiles. The median of the data is represented by this big bar across the middle, and the mean is depicted with an X. So it's really easy to, at a glance, look at a histogram or look at a box and whisker plot and understand the layout of that data and how it might work. But a lot of people are not familiar with box and whisker plots, and it's a lot to explain to people how a box and whisker plot works and what it is. I've tried multiple times to explain to people how quartiles work, and it's still really hard. And it's not something that I want to be doing when I want people to be focusing on the insights that I'm trying to share. So we can take that same data and we can visualize it differently. Now, is it a perfect snapshot of the way the data is constructed, like the box and whisker plot is? Not necessarily, but it can still make the same point, and I don't have to spend as much time explaining how box and whisker plots work. And I've heard it bandied around that pie charts are never okay. Pie charts are okay sometimes. Again, it's all in service of illustrating the point that you're trying to illustrate. There are some rules and guidance around when you want to use pie charts. For example, you don't want to use it when you've got multiple small categories and it's hard to figure out what's going on. But if you've just got 2 or 3 items on a pie chart, that's fine. If that'll serve your purpose and allow people to view the insights that you have to share, totally acceptable. So in order to seize the treasure, we want to highlight the point. So the graph by default that it makes in Excel or Power BI or however you're making it won't explain itself magically. So you can use captions or texts to further explain or highlight what your data is meant to show. Don't be afraid to draw a red box or a red arrow that points to the peak of the chart if that's the thing that you're trying to get people's attention on. Don't be afraid to add things to your charts, to add text and include that stuff, and explain why it's important and what it means. It's the climax of the story, and you want it to feel that way. And if I have one rule about charts that I present, whether that's reporting or any venue, it's always label your axes. Because every time that I've tried to skip a step and not do that, it leads to confusion and questions that it would have been better served to be just including those axes. So always label your axes. There are lots of ways to share data, to present it. So leadership presentations, stakeholder, executive summaries, detailed reporting, dashboards. You want to consider the venue that you're going to be sharing this at. If you are presenting information to a bunch of subject matter experts and they want to get into the nuance, to the nitty-gritty, to the fine details, you can do that, but you want to consider the audience. If it's the first time they're going to be looking at anything from this database, maybe you stick to the high level, but you still tell that story and you still build this framework around it. So when you're presenting the work, you can recap the findings you've already given to drive the point home. So one of the things that I was told when I was training to be a researcher was that to tell them what you're going to tell them. So outline, tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So don't be afraid to drive that point home. That's the most important piece of this. And you want to create a bridge to any recommendations that come out of the suggestion. Just a little bit about conveying information. and I think this slide is out of order, but so I apologize for that. But I mentioned conveying information in graphics versus text. This is a textbook example of that. So foxes live to be around 3 years old in the wild versus 10 to 12 in captivity. You can see a very easy dichotomy in a graph that hits that point much, much easier. The other thing that I really want to add to this is that consider using templates for visual consistency, especially if you're giving a whole series of trainings. If you've never used slidemaster, and maybe that's something we can do after this if we've got some time, is show people slidemaster if you're not familiar with it. But slidemaster allows you to create a template that you can use, and you can also save PowerPoints as templated documents so that every time you open it, it creates a new PowerPoint using the same formatting. Because you'll notice all my Lean Learning Series trainings have looked almost identically. And it's because I have a template that I've built that is using Vermont branding standards to make sure they all have a similar visual consistency, because it comes across as more professional and in a lot of cases lends additional credence to the points you're trying to make. So you can theme slides to keep things visually consistent. If you have a longer presentation, for example, if you're presenting on research and your training is an hour long and you've got a lot of stuff to get through, consider using a navigation bug. And almost never use PowerPoint animation. It can be extremely distracting. Now, I know I did that in this specific training. There are times and reasons why you do that. Part of it's if you are going through a long stretch of a lecture-like thing and you want to keep people engaged and show them some cool animations. But you've got to use it liberally. And I probably overuse them a little bit to prove a point. Definitely to prove a point, no other reason. And also, if you're presenting this material, don't be afraid to, like, no one expects you to give a TED Talk. We're not all TED Talkers. We're not all professional speech writers. But you're a professional who speaks. So being prepared with your presentation and having gone through it enough times so that you know what slide's coming up next, and you can build a proper bridge to the next slide. You don't ever want to be surprised by a slide. At the same time, it is, I have known people that have over-prepared. I had a friend in grad school who would over-prepare presentations so badly that even when they weren't reading off their slides, it sounded like they were reading off their slides. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, but that's quite a sight to behold. But it's mostly about knowing what slide's going to come next and being able to build into those conversations. So when we put our data into action, we're undergoing the resurrection. So we're exhibiting our expertise, we're shining a spotlight of new understanding on the data set. So your data may exist in a data set, in a database somewhere. It may represent a survey that you ran. It could come from a lot of different places, but no one's looked at it the exact same way you have, and there are new insights, and you want to be able to highlight those. And identify any potential action items. So especially if we're doing this for a lean project or something like that, highlight the factors that you looked into and be like, this could be a key performance indicator. It's already built in the data set. We can build a report out of this. It would flow very nicely into our understanding of the project. And as we implement changes, we can track them and see if things get better. That's what people love to see, and will tell us if we're doing a good job. And you can always outline those potential opportunities which connect that initial context to the data insights that you've drawn. Every data analysis I do, I find, is returning with a boon. It teaches me something new, a new way of dissecting the data, a new way of processing the data, a new way of thinking about things. The more you do this, the better you get at it. So your basic skills grow. You learn new analysis techniques, maybe to solve a particular problem that you can use on future data sets as you encounter them. Or if you are working on the same data set over and over again, you can utilize those techniques and move maybe your data changes into macros or queries so that you don't have to redo the same analysis over and over again. Whether you started out as an expert in the field or not, you become an expert on that data set. And so you can answer a lot of other questions maybe that get posed along the way that you couldn't necessarily come back to solve a research question, but you can solve it in the future. And I mentioned those templates and macros that you created can be repurposed not just on the same data, but on other data or with slight variations and tweaks. Analysis becomes dashboards, key insights become KPIs. So it all sort of lives in a life cycle of continuous improvement that we hope to see. So that was a lot, and we went through 12 steps of utilizing the monomyth to sort of set up a framework for data storytelling. But what it really boils down to is 3 key takeaways, which I want to leave you with here, and then open things up for questions or walk you guys through the slidemaster if you think that would be valuable. But that's that you want to use data to either tell a story, or you can use the story framework to actually extract data. So when you're presenting it, you want to talk about, here's the broad framework setting data, and then here's the drill down into that information. So the narrative arc should use a logical progression of world building, general, then specific drill down statistics. And it's okay if you're not a statistics pro. There are a lot of basic fundamental tools that can be really valuable to doing analysis. And then visualize data, which speaks to those key insights. Ultimately, that's what you're here to do, regardless of how you're sharing this presentation. If you were doing data storytelling, it is to hit those points home. And if you walk away from a presentation or a report and you say, I satisfactorily believe that the key points which I wanted to make that were in the data, the key things that I wanted people to know, they know. And hopefully through the storytelling, they also have connected that to a framework and understand the implications and how that's connected to the wider world. But that's something, again, that you get better at the longer you do. So that's all I had for my presentation. If people want to see the slidemaster, I can show that. If people have questions, I would be happy to hear them. So I will shut up now and let you guys let me know what you want to do. And you can either unmute and talk to me or feel free to drop something in the chat. All right, I got at least one call for slidemaster.
Second slidemaster, please. Thank you.
Okay, that's pretty good. That's a lot of people that want to see slidemaster. Okay. So slidemaster is a really powerful tool for customizing PowerPoint presentations. Every presentation you've ever seen me give has been from my template that I created myself using the prescribed colors and texts and fonts of the Vermont branding standards. If you are unfamiliar with Vermont branding standards, you can go ahead and just Google Vermont branding standards. It's like it used to be the first document that pops up. Now it's like the second or third. I haven't tried it in a little while. All right, so if you go to View under PowerPoint, there are a bunch of options here, but the one that we're interested in right here is slidemaster. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. All right, and I'm going to scroll up because it always does that weirdly. But basically, what you're looking at right here is the template for this particular PowerPoint. And so there's a generic template that it will put on all slides. Whenever you hit new slide, basically the default thing that comes out. But each one of the subtypes of slides is actually included here as sort of a child of this parent. And you can modify them to suit your needs. So the first one on here is the title slide. So the title slide can be customized however you want so that every title slide you do can look exactly how you want it to look. The second one is the default slide that gets created when you hit new slide and it doesn't create a title slide, is exactly what it looks like. And everything you customize here, whether it be If I wanted to bold this or change the colors of what's going on, you can modify the individual bullets. So if I want the first bullet of every one of these to be a square, it will be a square. But only when using this particular slide, which is the default. I have not changed the overall parent, which you'll sort of have to play around with it to sort of get what you want, but you can set color themes. So I have a whole color theme set up that is state colors. But you can customize this stuff to any level you want. And once you're done customizing it to whatever level you want, and again, you can customize each one of the default templates that come in there. I tend to only modify the base copy, the title one, and then the first major type. And that usually tends to cover me. But now you'll notice that it changed all of my slides. So now the first item in a bulleted list is always bolded and always has a square. So when you create a new slide, if you use this information that's on here, the default stuff that it gives you, it will automatically change all that stuff, and it's automatically formatting it to exactly the way I did, and it'll keep doing that because that's how I had it formatted. It's a really, really easy way to customize your PowerPoint presentations and make sure your slides have a very similar visual consistency and are executed very well. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing that brand standards. I don't love the colors or the fonts, but they are the Vermont branding standards. And when we all adhere to the Vermont branding standards, it kind of gives us all an air of increased professionalism. So what you can do with this is you can start from scratch to build a PowerPoint presentation that fits your needs, that has a slidemaster customized to do exactly what you want it to do. And then when you go to save it, so I have to save a copy, instead of saving it as a PowerPoint or a .pptx, you can save it as a PowerPoint template or a .potx. And then anytime you start a new presentation, instead of going in and starting a new PowerPoint from scratch and picking another one of those default templates that they already have, you can open up your template and it will create a new PowerPoint presentation. So Marie asked if what happens if you paste into a PowerPoint from another presentation. It will if you use the elements that came by default. So I'm using the default box here, and if I type stuff in this and then I copy and paste this slide to another presentation that has a different format, it will take on a different format. So for example, if I go ahead and I change the design from my template to this, you'll notice that it changes everything because I used the default text. But if I go ahead and I add a text box and I just say hi, hello, and I want that to be a bulleted list, and then I go ahead and I change the design, you'll notice that it changes the font, but not much else. So for me, when I go ahead and I create a new PowerPoint presentation, I don't have to open up a new PowerPoint. I could just right-click on PowerPoint, either here or pinned on my Start menu, and I've pinned my PowerPoint template. So when I click it, it's going to automatically create a new PowerPoint presentation, but it's got exactly the same formatting as my old PowerPoint presentation. So that's how I start every new PowerPoint that I create. And you can create any number of these. So like I've got one right here that is basic. I created one using the A3. So when I want to create a new A3, all I have to do is do that, and I get exactly the A3 that I'm looking for, which is the DEC template for A3s that has my own KPIs on there and stuff. It's really great enhanced functionality, and it makes using PowerPoint a lot easier. All right. So we talked a little bit about data storytelling. We talked about how we can customize PowerPoints to be effective. That's all I had to show and talk about. Does anyone else have any questions on any of the stuff I talked about, whether that's data storytelling, whether that's PowerPoint or templates, the Vermont branding standards? Taking all questions. All right. Brenda says, thank you. I don't hear any comments. So thank you for attending today's Monday training. We got one left next week, which is going to be Monday at 10 o'clock, and it's on human-centered design. I definitely recognize some of the people in here as having trained on human-centered design. I hope to see you all here, and this training will be going up on that same link as the other ones have gone on. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. So thank you all so much. And if you have any questions, my team's chat window is always open, and you can always send me an email. So
Thank you, John.
absolutely, thank you. And you guys have a great week.